Hi everyone, I've continued to develop this new series of miniature watercolor paintings, and now I'm up to the third one in the series. A few years ago I actually begun a series of miniature watercolor paintings, and I wound up creating a few hundred of these miniature paintings. Let's take a closer look at my newest one. The painting that you just saw behind me is an acrylic on canvas painting that I created a few years ago, and it's entitled Blue Orchid. This is the painting that I just completed and that you'll watch me develop in the video. I scanned the original drawing into my computer and cleaned up the line work, then printed the clean version onto 140-pound Arches watercolor paper. And it's the tiny, cleaned up, printed version that I developed into the finished watercolor painting that you see over here. Now that I have a digital version of the original drawing, I can create watercolor variations on this existing composition, and even incorporate this particular watercolor composition into my watercolor paper pendants. For example, this pendant that features the magnolia, I not only used the original drawing to create a small watercolor painting, but I also used the same compositional sketch for this watercolor paper pendant. To begin this beautiful orchid, I'm going to start with the center petal. The color is a mixture of quinacridone red with cobalt blue. The cobalt blue pushes the red towards the violetish area. I'm using a 0 size round paintbrush. The area is primed for the watercolor. The color that I'm about to apply is going to be a combination of the quinacridone red with a little bit of cobalt blue added to it. Yeah, that's the violet that I want. To begin, I'm going to apply a general wash of the violet that I just mixed towards the edge and allow it to bleed in towards the center where it seems to lighten a bit. The petal folds over upon itself in this area, so I'm ending my wash right there along the fold line. I also see, as I look at it and apply the paint, an almost pure hint of quinacridone red, so I'm also going to add unmixed quinacridone red. And interestingly, as it modulates towards the center, it picks up a little bit of a yellowish green in there. I'm not going to do that now, because the yellowish green is clearly defined by that line here and here. So I'm going to allow that to dry before I do any further development. The petal has a very pronounced dappled quality along the edge. What I'm going to do first is simply apply a little water in this area, and that's going to start to push the paint towards the edge. Having done that, I'm also going to sprinkle a very tiny amount of salt along the edge of that petal. Not much, but enough to interact with the surface. I need to allow the area that I just sprinkled salt onto to dry before I can do any more development in that area. Now I'm priming this thinner petal with clean water in preparation for the application of a light blue wash. I'm working in the very pale wash of cerulean. I'm going to allow that to dry before I do anything else. I dampen the petal. Now I'm going to flow in my mixed purple color. That's a combination of quinacridone red and cerulean blue, and some additional clean water to push the color. It's been a while, and the watercolor paint is dried. It's also time to brush off that salt. There's a little bit of greenish yellow in the center there that I'm going to work in now. So what I'll do is prepare the center color. That's a mixture of aureolin yellow and a touch of cobalt blue. I'd like a little bit more push towards the yellow. Good. For the green, I'm going to dampen just that central area because the petal folds over right here, and I want to capture that. But I do want the green to flow out this way. Very light touch. See how it's picked up? I can even tilt it a little bit and allow gravity to do its thing. Now, to create the edge effect, where the color modulates from the purple to a much lighter value of blue, I redampen the petal. As you know, redampening it once it's 100% dry will not pick up the color underneath, as long as you don't overdo it. Now, along the edge, and along the other edge. You'll see a little hint there. And I'll flow some water because I want to push it back towards that edge. Good. I have to let that dry before I can add these petals. So let's get the two bottom ones in. Clean water, clean water. Having primed the petal with clean water, I'm working in cerulean blue. I'm going to work in this detail right over here. So first I am going to flow in my blue and allow it to dry. Can't do much right now. Have to let these dry before I can introduce the second color. And I even see some ultra fine veins in there that I would like to capture. Hey, we have a very light thing there, a petal. The petal's actually a combination of the blue and the violet, so let's get the light blue washed down. Let it dry. No need to dampen that for such a minutely small area. It's completely dry. Time to redampen. And now I'm flowing in a mixed magenta into the edge of the dampened area. And I do the same thing on the other small petal, and then add some clean water to push the color to the edge and create a gradual transition in tone. Moving up to the orchid, which is behind the primary orchid, I'm flowing in quinacridone red mixed with permanent magenta. Starting to see how the petals fold and fold and fold, and I like that detail. The next thing I like to do is start to capture the surface pattern that I see on the orchid. And I'll begin by working from the center out. And to do that, I'm going to use permanent magenta. And I'm going to transfer some to here. I always take a little from my color bin and apply it to a mixing surface. That enables me to control the degree of color density by adding more water. This is all very dry, so I can paint right into it. The speckles concentrate most densely towards the center of the petal, and the pattern on the petal divides itself in half along a center line. I allowed this part to dry. Now I'm going to continue to lay in the dots on this side. Using the permanent magenta that I actually add a little quinacridone red to shift it more towards the reddish side. I begin to lay in the little tiny dots. It's important when you do this to work with the very tip of the brush. I want to capture some very faint ones, so I added color. Now I'm lifting that color out and just applying a little bit of plain water to the dot. Some pure quinacridone red will also work in this area. Since they are completely dry, I'm going to very lightly superimpose some dots over my first layer of dots to begin to develop the density that I actually see in the photo. Another little detail that we have here is the way the petal folds over upon itself. So I'm going to dampen one of them now. Take a little of that magenta with the quinacridone red. Put it into the damp area. Then with some plain water, add it and allow it to push the color towards the edge. Now this petal lightens in the middle. What does that mean? It means I'm going to take my mixture of magenta and quinacridone red. Why not Winsor red or cadmium red? The reason is the quinacridone has a shift towards the violet that I really need. That's what's in the petal. Cadmium or even Winsor are too much like a spectrum red. Here. Okay, there we go. There's Winsor red. It's pure red. It's not the color of the orchid. Whereas that red, which is a mixture of the magenta and the quinacridone, has a strong shift to the blue or to the violet, which is perfect for the orchid. Yeah, that's what I want to see. And I'll introduce a dot of water. Leave it alone right now. I'll dampen it. Go to my magenta. Now I'll lift some color out. As you can see, I pre-dampened that area. And now I'm flowing the mixed color along the edge of the large petal and allowing the color to flow on its own without brushing towards the petal's center. Then I add clean water to the center of the petal, which flows into the newly applied wet paint, creating a natural transition from white to the magenta color of the petal's border. I can continue to introduce these dots. I wonder what the botanical name for them is. I have to look into that. I had given that the blue tint before. Now I'm going to redampen it and apply just a little bit of the magenta and quinacridone color to that area. Then with plain water, I'm going to encourage it to blend up a little bit. See how it kind of droops down? Yeah. And while all this is drying up, I can begin to add a little bit of the green. For that green, I'm going to mix cobalt blue with aureolin yellow. That'll give me a nice green. Similar to that. Don't rely on pre-mixed tube greens. They are secondary colors that can be more effectively mixed with blues and yellows. The green that you see me mixing here is a combination of aureolin yellow with cobalt blue, and this mixture results in a very natural looking green. Now I'm applying the newly mixed green to the orchid's leaf detail. Before I articulate the center line of that, I'm going to let that dry. Developing the other large petal, first I flow in the pre-mixed magenta color along the perimeter of the dampened petal. Then I add plain water. Time to let these areas dry. Can't do anything with them until they thoroughly dry. What I do see here, though, is a very subtle tint of green on the bottom of that petal. First, I dampen the area using a clean brush. Then I diluted my green with a lot of water. I'm going to flow it in. But it wants to move up. So now I'm going to reintroduce clean water and push it back down. You can also tilt it and make gravity work for you. Now the beauty of having dampened it prior to that is the color. The green does not get into the paper. So if I want to lift a little out, and I just want the subtlest tint, I can with a damp brush. And then apply some more water. What does that do? It pushes the green down and just gives me a subtle hint. I've given the watercolor time to dry, and all these areas now can be worked into again. And while it was drying over here, I laid in one of those very subtle veins that I had mentioned earlier on. See it? Very faint line. And I'd like to show you how I do that. Dampen the brush, and then I dampen the entire area where I want the edge of the dampened area to create the new vein. Right there. Then I go to the color that I plan on using, and I flow it into that dampened area. What do we have now? We have what appears to be a wash. So, I take my brush, cleaned it off, flow some plain water into that wash, then lift out the color. I continue to do this. Flow in water, lift out color. Until I achieve the fine vein. I think you get the idea now. I'm dampening the area. The preliminary dampening of the area is extremely important because it creates a water barrier. It primes the paper and prevents the paint that I'm applying as a wash from sinking into the fiber of the paper. The next thing I do is I apply water. You see how the water pushes the pigment to the edge? Now I lift out the color. Do it again. It should be clear that watercolor painting is not simply a process of putting paint on paper. It's a process of applying paint and then working with the color, sort of directing it and encouraging it to do certain things. Sometimes you just want to leave it alone and let it bleed and blend. Other times you want to lift color out like I'm doing here to create a detail. Sometimes you might want to sprinkle a little salt to create a dappling quality that is impossible to achieve by using a paintbrush. And there are many other things that you can do. I can also begin to work in those dots. And for those dots, I'm going to my mixture of quinacridone and permanent magenta, and I'll begin to apply them. They concentrate down the center of the petal. And my objective here is to create a subtle randomness so they don't look artificially applied. Now they're a little heavy, so what does that mean? I'm going to lift out very carefully some color. The dots on the orchid themselves seem to have a nice transparent quality to them. By lifting out a little color and then applying water, I lighten those dots up. I plan to continue developing the dots. Also, the veins. In fact, since I have this one like this, let's add a delicate vein to this side. First, the dampening process. Now I take a bit of my color, which is the magenta, with a little quinacridone red mixed in with it. Flow in clean water to push the color to the edge, and then lift it out. Time to let that dry. The vein will precipitate along the edge of the water bead. This petal seems to come from the orchid that is behind the primary orchid. That's a nice little detail for that area. Before I paint it in, the underneath petal that we see modulates to a greenish tint. I already have my green mixed. It's the same green I applied there, which is aureolin yellow and a light touch of cobalt blue. To introduce that subtle tone, I'll wet the area. I usually carry it up pretty far to allow the color to naturally blend into the petal. Now I'm going to take a very light wash of the mixed green. There we go. The objective here is to be subtle. That's it. Getting back to the leaf that I washed in the foundation color of green, the area has completely dried and now I'm redampening it. Next, using a drier version of the mixed green that I originally applied, I'm painting in the center line detail. That bled the way I intended it to bleed, but when it is dry, I may enrich this area here with a little bit more yellow. I do see a hint of green there. We're working on subtleties now. In these situations, I use very little paint, but I use enough to create the hint of color, the suggestion of color that is necessary. Okay, let's leave that alone. And eventually I'll do it over here too. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to darken this area a bit. So once again, I'm going to dampen it. I've mixed some cobalt blue with that quinacridone red to get a nice purplish violet color. that I think will be very effective right there. But I'm striving for subtlety. I don't want it to be a dramatic color change. I just want to suggest that the petal curves a little at that area. How do you establish a curve? By a transition from light to dark. It's also happening over here, and I could even work into that a little bit more. What I did off camera is I wet the area and I flowed a little bit more quinacridone throughout here. I'm going to continue that on this side now. I'm applying more quinacridone red to this area of the petal to enhance the reddish magenta tonality of the center petal. I've been having a bit of fun painting in the speckles on the orchid. And I've noticed that the bottom petal has a fold right here that would be a nice element to introduce. So, to achieve that, I'm going to flow in magenta, permanent magenta. The fold is darker on the orchid, so permanent magenta would be a good selection. Notice I didn't wet the paper this time. It folds up and around. With a damp brush, add clean water. The wet paint forms a canal of water that I can now lift out. Into the magenta, I'm going to float some quinacridone red, because that fold does have a reddish cast to it. And I'll suck some of that out. Good. Now just some plain water, and I'll allow that to dry. It's time to lay in the background. I primed the entire background area with water. I'm looking at my photo, which is to my left, and I'm going to paraphrase the colors that I see, but I'm not going to copy the detail. To begin, I'm going to flow in some neutral tint. Continue it up on here. It's important to maintain a continuity to the background. Backgrounds don't end when they touch objects, they continue. Now I'd like to begin to introduce some burnt sienna. I actually think it's an out-of-focus flower part back there. But it's a beautiful brown color. The burnt sienna is so rich. These darker, more neutralized colors in the background create wonderful complements to what's happening in the foreground. I'm switching to my tinier brush here. It's a little risky going into that area with a number 6. Now what needs to be done? I need to establish the relationship between that and that, so I'll work in my burnt sienna. Some more of those greens. Lift a little of that color out, throw it down there, and throw it in there. So I relate all of these areas that are separated by the petals of the orchid. Bring that down into here. What I'll do as a final step is bring out some highlights. And I notice in here there are some little white dots that I would like to suggest. So I'm going to work around my surface now and develop some of the subtle highlights that I see. And that'll be it. The last thing that I usually do to my small watercolor paintings is paint in a border. The fun part. The border's dry, the background's dry. Now I'm going to sign it. And it's always a challenge where to sign it. I don't think I want to sign it there because I have black ink in my rapidograph pen. And the signature would be too dominant. I think I'm going to sign it over here in the darker side. The watercolor miniature is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching the video.